Guardian of Bones. On the south side of the island of Corfu, where Odysseus passed before reaching the allegedly kingdom of Ithaca, there is for centuries an old cemetery hidden in a forest of age-old trees and deep shadows. Its soil is fluffy. It is even said that it is more fertile than the plain that exists next. And next to this macabre peculiarity, the myth has to add some more. This place lives by the flesh of the people it manages to grab, since usually the first nights when the moon empties, someone, a local or a passerby, is lost on his way to cross this land. The subject was avoided by discussion, and those peddlers and adventurers who attempted to explain what was going on were either betrayed by their logical thinking or resigned and entrusted the explanation of the mystery to closed local mouths. The legend of the old cemetery was preserved through time and enriched with popular descriptions and narratives that emphasize the peculiarity of the terrain, steep and sloping, and the deep darkness spread by the shadows of conifers and other evergreens, even at the brightest time of a summer day. That August noon, the midsummer of the sun, found the hero of our story working out a futile thought, seated in the thickets of a great cedar. If the ravine that stretched beneath his feet were indeed that of the only one, he would be the first to return to the world with pictures of it. It was the time that the first cameras were invented, and a photograph, especially one that depicted a place inaccessible to the eyes of people, illuminated the name of its creator with fame and admiration. All he needed was to get out of the woods and find the way. Many were those who had come, had wandered into a part of the cemetery, and had returned, not particularly impressed with either great discoveries or interesting facts. Everyone had adhered to the basic rule of survival in this place, not to pass beyond the horseshoe, an incomprehensible in the way of growth sharp turn of the path, which folded and continued around the axis of the one who walked, a continuous left-footed downhill, passing under arches of giant bushes and branches hanging from trees, passages which the character of their shapes seemed easy to memorize on the return, and which at the first glance from the other side seemed to have multiplied and each to have been mixed up in a multitude of its own. All those who had seen the horseshoe would surely have been marveled, as if hypnotized at the deep dark texture left by nature in their eyes, and would certainly have changed, satisfied that luck and perseverance had rewarded them with this magical image. There were few who insisted or bribed the old man to lead them deeper into the forest, and only two had decided to go on alone. No one ever knew what happened to them. Certainly there were others, some by their own luck, some who traversed the forest, but superstition and ignorance of the world kept their mouths shut, and the legend of this place surpassed its real danger. This is what at least our hero believes so far. The keeper of the cemetery, an old man who was indifferent to the whole world, lived in the last hut on the right, above the edge of the hill, and divided his day into two jobs: to guard the horseshoe from passers-by, or the other way around, since those who pass by sometimes do not imagine what awaits them, and to take care of the new graves in the new wing that stretched to the west and covered half the small valley. There were also some old ones there, most of them 3 centuries old, with a content of unknown elements, which simply reminded anyone who was interested to learn that once the island was a Frankish and Venetian spoil. The old man knew the history of every one of the 800 tombs, even those designated only by an empty stone slab. For this ability, and for the mood that seemed to remain in a place of morbid nostalgia, the community had granted him a stone hut and a few grazing rights for his flock, a few wild goats next to 5 or 6 domesticated goats, who were only allowed to enter one of the 2 rooms when darkness fell. It was that noon that old Zotos paid no heed to the words of the passerby, who asked if he had time to go, and turned from the ravine until the sun set. In his life, he had been forced to answer many similar questions, and some even insisting until he could persuade the naive explorer not to go further. He was tired. He was older than his 1,000-year-old face showed, and probably foreshadowed the end. She was wearied. He refused to answer, making only a mild nod of aversion, and his attention returned to the distant horizon of the west, beyond the last graves. Somewhere there his own was waiting for him. The stranger respected his silence, and passed by him with a sharp salute, which sounded like an order to recruits. With the aid of the compass, he kept a steady course to the eastward, and following the narrow ridge, the first hump halfway up the hill, he found himself facing the Horseshoe, facing a world plunged in darkness. There he realized that he had lost his orientation. As much as the compass insisted on pointing north to his left, the sun was on the right, and in front, it was near dusk, as if the south had changed position with the west. He smiled at this illusion, struck the compass 2 or 3 times on the trunk of a tree, and, being convinced that she was to blame for this inconsistency, put it in his pocket and proceeded. The first part of the descent was passable, easy, and pleasant to the feet. The hospitable foliage of the path invited him to speed, to relax his senses and enjoy the splendor that, like everyone in the land of the Greeks, took centuries. The delight lasted for a while. It might have seemed so to him, and it gave way to a hostile field of thorny vegetation that pierced his feet to his knees and forced him continually to turn, choosing the least painful passages. Now he walked on fearfully, with a wild disposition to protect himself against something that did not exist, and yet he felt it approaching. For some time he wandered crouched under arches of ivy and drooping trees, and was able to stand up when the discreet slope of the ground turned into a steep descent, leaving some openings for the shoulders and head. Sometimes he would have to do it for fear of losing his balance, even if he had to scratch his face against the pointed needles of the branches. Somewhere there, when he felt the first blood trickling down his cheek from the dry tentacles of a pine, he met a large cedar and sat down on its root to rest. It was the first opening he met with, a corner of 2 feet square imposed by the girth of the trunk and the roughness of the ground, 2 great boulders that seemed to have been separated by the strength of the evergreen upward. It was impossible to calculate the distance, but he was sure that many yards ahead of him and farther down the land was sinking into a dark horizon, hidden in the dense vegetation of evergreen giants. There were the oldest tombs and the narratives he had managed to extract, all of them nostalgic confessions in the form of a fairy tale, made because of an above-ground architectural paradise centuries old, which continued in a basement, which the imagination and traditions of the locals had not yet to tame with words. Others spoke of caves immortal, chasms descending lower and lower, others of arcades carved by the hands of gods and titans. It was the spot where superstition was tinged with the mist of myth. The slabs of ancient tombs were described as pieces of land, expanses of whole square meters that forever kept their secrets. The detailed confidences, based on a text of dubious existence and value, if any of the last century, described the royal coexistence of the 2 forces of this world, human civilization and nature. Giant marble pillars, magnificent patios made with gold mosaic and mineral materials, surrounded and surrounded, imposed or retreated to the power of the Virgin Mother Mary. The stranger looked at his watch and calculated the bright hours of the day that remained. He had already walked for more than one. He supposed it would take 2 more or so to cross the steep slope and find himself in the bowels of the ravine, and he had only 1 left, which was certainly not enough to return. He looked around him. Everything looked dark and alike. It could have come from any direction, since each of the clusters and arches around looked the same as the rest, and behind those he saw stretched others, similar to them. He realized that he was surrounded by a dark mass that was folding in all directions at every step. He followed the ground, which continued to descend to his left, and discerned a small opening between two thorny bushes, the only outlet for him in the maze he had lost into. A few yards below, the dense wall of vegetation thinned, and his eyes beheld with horror and awe the silent landscape. Before him stretched a different forest, a picture whose fading colors reminded her of old gravure. The trunks of the trees, straight and with absolute symmetry in all their dimensions, stood like pillars of an ancient temple, bearing out of the heavy shadow of their foliage the whole world. The man could distinguish the vertical line he had to follow to reach the ravine. He traveled as many meters as the slope of the ground allowed him and met the first graves. He perceived them beneath his footsteps, hard and smooth stony ledges in the earth, buried under the dry leaves and soil. In some he discerned Latin figures and signs of trying to open themselves. It would be folly to believe that he could lift these volumes, which only the appearance of them sufficed to show their weight, more than the strength of many men could bear to lift. The roughness on the surface of some testified to the insistence of their profiteers to violate them, without of course any result, only some scratches and fringes of stone on the sides and corners. The awe he felt quickly transformed into a metaphysical shudder, a sensation one feels when facing the impossible or some inconceivable truth. Stumbling on the root of an oak giant, his eye fell on a piece of stone that seemed beneath his tread. It looked like a tomb slab that had been opened in front of the tree, but it was nothing but a memento of the name of the one who lay buried under the roots. The two symbols, one of his order and that of the power he served, of Christendom, explained the long, half-forgotten name. And the finding that the giant oak had been feeding for so many years on the bones and flesh of this man, however lurid or exaggerated it might sound, was enough for him to be convinced that he was approaching his mythical destination. He crawled around a few more trees and found that each of them was the birthplace of a burial, a monument begging from the gods eternal honor for the sake of inglorious death. The essence of all heroism lies in the sacrifice, the inept for mortals, that act which, although it brings death, gives birth to life for those who remain. He rose to his knees and walked over the folds of the ground. 10 earthen steps dug into the earth by the rainwater and the rooted arms of cedar. The road he was following descended more and more incline, until he was forced to stop. Now he was at that point where the slope became a precipice with perpendicular sides, flimsy ground, and dense low vegetation, which filled the gaps of the clumps of cypresses and beeches. From here, he could only go on at the risk of becoming one of those whom no one ever knew of their fate. He preferred the side street. He moved a few paces to the right, followed the brow of the cliff, and grasped the tree by its trunk. A few yards afterwards, he met a clump of rocks from which a path was beginning. Here, there was no dense vegetation, only a few stunted cypresses, sparsely sprouted, and huge oaks stretching out their tentacles like mythical monsters of the deep. His walk resembled a circus rope walker. His footsteps straggled one behind the other across a trench of earth, a thin track of line that continued parallel to the ravine and heading east. On his right, he could still see the ancient forest with its giant children, and under his feet, on the left, and at a depth of 50 feet, the deep green of the tops of other evergreens hid from his eyes the ravine. The ground was flimsy, full of leaves and cypress trees, which made it unstable and perfect for a death dive. He consulted the compass. The needle pointed to the north on his left, but his instinct reacted to this hint. For some inexplicable reason, he felt that the north was behind him, in token of agreement, and as a proof of his darkest fears, the needle moved and pointed at him. A few yards further down, he moved again and pointed to the right. He was sure that among the 3 indications, and given the straight course he had been following for so long, The last was certainly a mistake. He closed the compass and continued with a guide his conception of space. All he had to do on the way back was to follow the same path upside down until he met the clump of rocks, then the point with the unexpectedly steep slope of the ground, then a turn left and crawl between the trees' graves until he met the twisting of the path in the shape of a meander, that inexplicable weirdness of the earth that would lead him to the top of the horseshoe and from there to the outside world. Everything seemed easy and neat to the mind of one who used to spend his time exploring places. He looked up. The volumes of the giant trees on his right stretched out and joined those of the oaks beside and in front of him, keeping even the slightest ray of the sun away from the ground. It was afternoon, and his feeling insisted that the sun was behind him, about to set, but the tints of the foliage above him testified that the light was besieging the forest from the right. He shook his head and attributed his confusion to fatigue, refusing to believe that he was lost. He glanced still under his feet. The thick evergreen lane continued to stretch parallel with the path he was following. He reassured himself that what he was thinking of as absurd was merely games of his mind. He continued to walk, looking down, picking his steps carefully. The uniformity in the appearance and texture of the ground fatigued him, and he gave birth now and then to brief thoughts that he might have been lost before he had even reached his destination. Now and then he came across stone slabs, some half buried, others with their silhouette projecting through the leaves and brambles, and one broken in two. He tried to lift one piece and gave up the attempt as soon as he realized that the plate had become one with the earth. The overexertion gave him vertigo. He squatted over her and emptied one bottle of water, leaving a little to wash the sweat off his face. With the aid of a cigarette, he regained the slow rhythm of his breath and tried to form a map of his situation. His logic was reacting to what he had to assume, that the landscape, that surrounded him formed part of the southern hinterland of the island. The distances he thought he had traveled disagreed with the local maps. If he had walked as far as he thought, then in a little while he should have smelled the saltiness of the east coast. This would mean that he was in the little southeast valley of the island, where no evergreens and no rift of land had any place. He looked up again and searched the dark canopy of evergreens for a sign of the sun. The bright glare, which he could only guess at now, grew heavier and heavier, dyeing the landscape with hues of mourning and mystery. Now he felt eyes watching him from everywhere, hidden in shadows and in places he could not look. He had to decide where he would spend the night. As the darkness thickened around him, the wild boar awoke from the torpor of day. He became conscious of death, and the primeval fear of everything dead hummed within him along with the rustling of the wind. He fancied himself threatened by an invisible, invincible enemy, a danger which he was unable to determine. And this lack of composure strained his senses more as time went on. He needed a safe spot to rest. This opportunity was given him in the next few yards, where he found himself in front of a deep, narrow crevice of the ground, which furrowed the slope perpendicularly to the path and descended to the depths of the ravine. It was a straight line less than a meter wide and about 2 deep, which seemed carved by the hand of a geometrician god, faithful and absolute in its straightness and easy of descent. Its interior, a jumble of soil and ferruginous materials, seemed accessible and with a moderate degree of difficulty to descend it. The march lasted a few minutes, and by the light of his lantern a pleasant walk was made. When he reached the height of the tops of the first trees, he felt more secure, although the landscape was shrouded in a profound darkness. 30 yards below, the fissure widened, until it faded into a plateau with zero slope of the ground, in absolute horizontal arrangement. He was in the heart of the secret ravine, and the semicircular motion of the lantern revealed a landscape growing to his eyes as he advanced, painted with a grayish-blue light, without limits to the dimensions of those he beheld. Everything seemed eternally made, vast and immovable in the passage of time. Looking up, carried away by the gray and blue hue of the air, he realized what no one until then had dared or never been able to describe. He was at the first meters of an underground world, tens of meters below the earth dyed with sunlight. That was all he could infer by looking at the dark vault that opened before him. High up, like stars in a secret subterranean universe, he could discern here and there little cracks, openings that let a little of the last light of day pass. He felt that he was in a vast hall stretching out without end in all directions, a landscape without limits and dimensions, advancing as far as he. The place was overgrown with evergreen trees, similar in shape to any known evergreen, but with black branches and leaves. There were mostly beeches and cedars, while the thousands of cypresses right and left in the distance stood stripped, endless phalanxes of leafless wooden needles, growing on barren land. The forest sometimes thickened, and at other times thinned from the course and from the branches of Silent River, which elsewhere separated the clumps of trees by creating openings, elsewhere succumbed to their presence by passing by. Its width and strength changed from the peculiarities of the soil. It was divided into many babbling streams, which overflowed foam, and after a few meters became a spreading mass of water, slowly digging further the earth, creating from time to time small tributary beds that took their way to some distant horizon. Many yards below, the landscape was again becoming a deep ravine. To the right and to the left stood slopes overgrown. He was proceeding stealthily up the current of the river, following a horizon of incalculable depth. The strangest thing of all was how this prospect of infinity could both be discerned and understood. He felt part of this hidden world and cognizant of the independence that characterized him. The faint light spread as far as his eye could reach, accentuating some of the details of the landscape, the sharp corners of some trees, the rugged terrain of the mountain slopes, and the silver-blue ribbons of the flowing water. He wondered if it was a mirage or if the place hid his own secret. His watch was now showing the first dark hour of the night, and this rapid, in his sense, passing of time made him suppose more to wish that he might have discovered the secret to be found at one of the rumored gates of time. He fumbled his face, searching for some signs that might prove a journey into the past of youth or the near future of old age. He leaned over an unspoiled little pool of water and lighted his face with the lantern. The cuts on the forehead and around the lips were the same as before. All that had changed was the intensity in his eyes from the eerie journey he had been living. He looked behind him and calculated how much he had walked since the point of his descent. He measured, in his mind and doubtfully, 300 yards. He might have been mistaken. He might have been longer than he felt he had walked. He might have been too far in the distance to stimulate his spirits. If his above-ground nature had not prevailed, he might have ignored the night and gone on to his unknown destination. He was a creature of the upper world, however, and did not intend to renounce his habits. He chose the spot where he would spend the night and spread the contents of his sack in the midst of the little flat. Next door, he gathered as much wood as was necessary to start a hospitable fire and saw its light after many efforts, and after spending half the alcohol on the damp, dry leaves and twigs he had twisted under the pile. Enjoy the warmth on his body and face, along with a simple dinner of bread and olives and half a bottle of wine. He filled his lungs voraciously with smoke and fell asleep leaning on his things. The duration of his sleep was limited by everything that frightened him or demanded an answer, staged in a messy dream performance, a theatrical delirium of figures with superhuman possibilities. Try the highest sense of satisfaction, pride, in view of an immense landscape representation of the human creation, flying over the most brilliant historical yearbooks, monuments, battles, declarations of independence, comprehensible and simplified images of history and culture. The whole immortal tug-of-war from the Iron Age, from the dawn of the centuries, up to the overweening complexity of the modern truth and the brilliant conquest's bright spirit, until the mighty ravages, all those monstrosities of intolerance. In the midst of these representations, the sudden alternation of demonic forms and heroes, the appearances of anthropomorphic monsters and terrestrial gods, the eternal battle between Pan and Nothing, lasted as long as the raid of a predator on Earth, the free fall to prey, even though more than 9 hours had passed. His watch showed a few minutes before sunrise, but the steady, bright coloring of the landscape made him think that all the sunrises of the upper world were born and died invisible here. He gathered the scraps and added a few branches over them. He waited for the flame to rise up to his face and stood up. On the bank of the river, he plunged his head into the deepest spot he could distinguish, where the rush of the water was interrupted by a stone cluster. He felt the wet mass clinging to his cheeks and pulling at them with a child's obstinacy. The shock of the cold and the numbness from forehead to jaw made him draw back. He clasped his palms under the water and emptied their load on the top of his head. Most of it was lost in the waves of his hair, and only a few drops escaped up to their ends, and thence they slipped and descended to the backbone, divided into fine lines. He turned to the companionship of the flame, which played above the scintillation of the timbers, and roasted some coffee. He looked around him, the hills behind and before him, and the valley opening in the distance, and hemmed him beside the fire. He wasn't cold. The atmosphere maintained the same temperature as last night, the pleasant natural coolness of a country house in summer. But the warmth that caressed his body welcomed him as a faithful friend, an optimistic call to action at the beginning of a new day. He packed his things in the sack and took the road to the depth of the valley, which on his imaginary map corresponded to a course south or southeast. This was the first time his calculus had agreed with the road he was following. Before him opened the south of an unknown, subterranean world. He went on for hours, and then he consulted his watch, which reassured him that outside it was still day, and that the time he had spent in meeting the rocky bulk was as long as it should be for one who seeks something unknown in the unknown. The endless wastelands stretching behind the stone mountain made the continuation of exploration impossible. There was no water, not even a trace of vegetation, and this absence of life gave birth to an indefinable fear, greater than the vagueness of the idea of death. Without being able to imagine what it meant, he represented with his mind a world non-existent in human consciousness, a place without life. He followed the downward course of the river until he saw its flow lost in the bosom of a cave, having first gathered itself into a shallow cavity of the ground in front of it. A stealthy movement of the water under the stillness of the lake was watering the root of the mountain. The river emptied incessantly into it, but its surface remained serene. The level did not change its height, and the water batten changed hands in silence, with that imperturbable silence of death. He listened to hear a splash, a slight foaming, a few bubbles emerging, something that proved a trivial, even act of defusing. This landscape stood out from the dull place behind it, from the misty hues of the expanse which he had passed, and which looked like an indistinct compound of luminous particles that phosphorescent and reflected its feeble light so far as to faintly describe the outline of the lake and the beginning of the wilderness behind the stone mountain. Silence and darkness covered the water that was flowing into the lake. The man lighted the lantern and saw the sinewy grooves, a series of imperceptible rustlings on the surface, concentric circles whirling before the mountain's edge. He lifted the lantern above his head, and, as was natural, could not distinguish the top of the stone bulk. He lay deeper in the earth than he had imagined. In front of him, the mountain finally swallowed the life-giving force of nature, keeping her imprisoned deeper even than the bowels of the earth, this secret place where she walked. The light of the lantern returned upon the surface of the lake, and thence spread its outline. Some parts of the short coastline stood out against the background of the semi-darkness from the trees in the distance. The man could now distinguish the asymmetrical lines of rocks, which encircled the water before it was swallowed. He looked round again, lighting up in every possible direction he could follow. All of them seemed indifferent, and seemed to promise what he had already met, evergreen and coniferous guardians of the place, giving for light a pale, spreading everywhere a mournful countenance. The stranger again lifted the lantern aloft. He could see some of the girths and line brows that popped out every now and then, little outcrops or ledges that an experienced climber might use to climb. He himself had no such experience. The mountain, moreover, was rising more than he could see, and its broad base shrank more and more as it rose, to end in a pillar which continued to ascend, until it was lost in the dark firmament that stretched high. He felt the immensity, the awe which the dark, starry sky of the upper world breeds multiplied. He felt weak, an insignificant fraction before the infinite. It was the awe of the mortal before his Maker. He was disturbed by this thought, which had followed him timidly from the first steps of his descent, to appear now before him with a suspicion of hubris. If this place was magical or enchanted, if, indeed, those who had arrived here had disappeared, then only one explanation could give. He was in the forbidden land, near, perhaps even in front, the passage of the dead to Hades. If his instincts were right, then his life might have been judged in the footsteps of the present day, when he decided to follow the quiet coastline of the river into the half-lit valley to end up here. If he were given the opportunity to return to the beginning of his journey, he would do it with all his gratitude and with the firm resolve to keep quiet about what he saw in exchange for keeping his life. Completing his wish, he looked back upon the path he had followed thus far, with a deep sigh of repentance. His watch pointed to the west. If she intended to obey his needs, she could cover a small part of the way back and spend the night somewhere. If his fear prevailed, he ought to have broken the most popular rule of men and put off to sleep for some safer place, returning to the upper world as quickly as possible. Absorbed in this dilemma, the certainty of his death or the paradoxical possibility of his salvation, he extinguished the lantern and crossed the first steps of the return, following the imaginary straight line up the river. The pale glare of the trees on the stones and his mental confusion prevailed. The strained sense of sight betrayed him, and the illusion of perception of space threw him into the wet trap. By the time he realized that he was at the bottom of the lake, he was struggling with clumsy movements to free himself from invisible hands, which clung to his clothes and held him beneath the surface. The splash of the water, at the moment of his first deep breath, roused him and compelled him to reconstruct thoughts and movements. His eyes were clouded. He could only see his hands appear and disappear in the darkness. He had completely lost his orientation, and, loaded with a sack weighing 5 pounds and the boots he wore, he felt helpless to hold on to the surface, imprisoned in a damp tissue of death. He got rid of his bobs, first the sack and then the boots, pulling them furiously one by one, and with them he was relieved of the panic when he remembered the water lines and the whirlpool he had seen before. So long as the water followed a steady course, all he had to do was to keep on the surface and let the current lead him to the edge of the lake in front of the mountain. He endured his short journey with strained reflexes, ready to be caught by the first rock his outstretched arms would meet. From the motion of the water and from his position in it, he could see that he was approaching the mountain with his back. He tried to make a 180-degree turn, using his hands for paddles. He succeeded in getting round without difficulty, and this little feat, together with the buoyancy of the water, which, quite unnaturally, enabled him to float without effort, was the last illusion he enjoyed. Now fully aware of what was happening, but unable to react, he felt himself sinking, drifting into the center of a mighty vortex, an invisible force pushing him forward into the water and then hurling upward with force. A few seconds of frantic marching elapsed when, in an indefinable struggle with unseen foes pushing him against each other, he managed to breathe a little air through the gaps created by the foaming of the water stream upward. No matter how many times he recalled those moments to his memory, he was unable to come to any definite conclusion. Over the years, little by little, the memories of the events of that day, the absence of image, the lack of perception of space, the difficulty of orientation, and left to endure helplessly his prejudiced future, outside the dimension of time, far from human measures. More than once he had wondered whether he was dead, or whether he was living the prologue of his death, a misty state similar to that of a patient in a coma. And there were so many others who doubted his condition, that he felt that the soul had been separated from the body, and that his every thought, every apparently logical or illogical conclusion, was the product of some strange process of his mind. He felt that some strong blow on the head was feeding hallucinations and delirium upon his consciousness. As long as he had lived in this place, now surely some years had passed, he had perceived his consciousness as a complement of a dreamy state, a coexistence of the mortal with the divine. To this conclusion he had been led, being a prisoner in this underground secret world, a captive and companion of the water that washed away the earth tens of meters beneath his feet. His prison was a tubular structure, a kind of well with a square diameter, filled with bubbling water, and surrounded by a hospitable earthen ring with unknown flora at the height where it stood. He could not calculate the depth beneath his feet, but he could discern the height of the walls above him more than 100 yards, and the openings that were sporadic his only hope of communicating with the world above. These subterranean channels, however, fed his never-ending days with nightmares. He could not count them, but he was sure there were more than he could see far above. Some bodies fell with so much force and raised so much water that only a fall from a great height could justify it. Incarcerated all these years in this damp prison, tens of meters below the earth, he had unlimited time to observe and to think about the reason or purpose of this macabre process. What he had seen gave birth to certain safe conclusions and a fear. From the higher openings fell those who had recently died, while from the lower ones appeared quantities of bones, vestiges of putrefaction. The first thing he thought of was that he was lying under some cemetery, whose users ignored or despised burial customs. Every time a body landed in the water, he expended his powers in shouts and invocations. He adhered to this habit for a long time, always keeping alive the hope that someone would stand near the corresponding opening and hear him. Funeral sequences are usually accompanied by long, deep silences. He fell out at every prediction. As the days went by, his worst fear was confirmed that he was living in a giant melting pot in which human bodies ended up. At first, he tried by all means to climb into one of the openings in the hope of taking an opposite course from that of the dead and getting out into the daylight. He didn't even get close to one. The humidity and the vertical slope of the walls kept him a prisoner in the earthen fold, surrounded by an unknown vegetation. Next to the water, sometimes rising gently, sometimes splashing with force up to the height where he stood, sometimes accepting and swallowing human flesh. For the last 2 years, too, he reckoned, but it might be 5 or 6 months. He had accepted his fate and treated every new arrival with unfeigned indifference. He measured, at least so he believed, by the bright mark above him, and very high up, an inconspicuous opening in the earth, for which the light of the sun was piercing when he rose. He reckoned himself an old man who was past 70, but even if this was an exaggeration, a mistake in counting time, it was still a wonder how he had managed to survive by drinking only the water that licked the wall and eating grass that grew in the lake's rim. He was there at 36, and had certainly counted however much he might fall out near 2 decades imprisoned in the world of the dead. How, however, did he feel himself as young as then? Close to all these futile conclusions and concerns came to be added a reasonable question. If indeed those who went down here had perished, if this underground world did not let anyone turn out, where had all of them ended up? All the way he had not met a sign of human, not even skeleton. The legend of the old cemetery led down here the footsteps of travelers for centuries and spoke of armies of naive suicide and disappeared. You shouldn't normally have met a single body of them. It is a question that torments every bone keeper who has been isolated in some crypt under the earth, in all lengths and widths of the planet, for centuries, and lives the silent torment of his eternal mortal existence, counting dead under some cemetery, waiting for a miracle, a day of judgment, to be resurrected to the light along with the dead of this world. Without knowing it, our hero kept souls of people under the real homeland of Odysseus, the chlorostylus island of the Ionian Sea, which once people trod on coming from the land, and which is known by the name Lefkada Island.